Hey everyone, and welcome back to our Stallion by Starlight readings. Today I'm reading chapter 9, which is the second to last chapter of this book, so we are almost finished. If you remember, in chapter 8, Jack and Annie took Bucephalus on a long, wonderful ride around Macedonia. They inhaled the magic mist that Merlin gave them and wished to be the best horse trainers in the world. And they really connected with Bucephalus. They found out what was bothering him, and they tamed him. As they were sneaking back into the stable, though, they ran into Prince Alexander, and that's where we left off. So, let's get started for chapter 9, The Truth. The stallion stopped and neighed at the prince. Alexander stood with his legs apart and his arms crossed. He was not smiling. "Hi there," Annie said. Alexander didn't answer. He glared at Jack and Annie. "I shall have you punished for stealing him," he said. "I have been looking for him everywhere." "We didn't steal him. We just took him out for a ride," said Jack. "Why did he let you two ride him?" Alexander asked. "Of all people." Jack started to make a comment about Alexander's attitude, but then he made a different decision. He decided to be kind. "Maybe he let us ride him because he knew that you are a friend of ours," he said. The prince looked confused by Jack's answer. "Really?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Well, I suppose that could be possible," Alexander said. He cleared his throat and took a deep breath. "So, where did he take you?" he asked. The anger had left his voice. Now it was filled with curiosity. "We just rode through town and down the main road and around the swamps and fields," said Annie. "I wish you had been with us." She swung her leg over the horse's back and slid to the ground. Jack did the same. The stallion neighed and brushed his head against Annie, then Jack. Annie giggled. "That tickles," she said. "How did you tame him?" Alexander asked. "We listened to him," said Jack. "Listened to him?" the prince asked. "What do you mean?" "It was sort of like we forgot about ourselves and paid total attention to him instead," said Jack. Alexander watched as Annie and Jack stroked the stallion's mane. "My father vows he will not waste his gold on this horse," he said, "but I see something very special in him. I believe he is extraordinary." "He is," said Jack. "He's incredibly loyal." "And he has a great heart," said Annie. "I know, I can tell," said Alexander. "Maybe you could tell your father that you will pay for him yourself," suggested Annie. "Do you get an allowance?" "I don't know what that means," said Alexander, "but no matter. I doubt that my father would agree to anything I propose. He has no respect for my opinions or my accomplishments." "Your father is wrong not to give you respect," said Jack, and he meant it. "One day all the history books will call you Alexander the Great." "Are you mocking me?" Alexander said, scowling. "No, it's true, I promise," said Jack. "Believe us," said Annie, "we know." "But listen," said Jack. "Being great doesn't mean you go around bragging about yourself all the time." "Don't tell everyone that you're a living Greek god," said Annie, "or that you're going to be master of the universe." "Or that you are the best athlete in the known world," said Jack. "Just accept that no matter what you can do, you are still a regular human being, a person, just like everyone else." "Are you insulting me?" said Alexander. "No," said Jack with a smile. "Stop that. We're all regular human beings. Why don't you just let yourself be a real person for a change and laugh at yourself? Be okay with making mistakes and looking like a fool." "Jack's right," said Annie. "I know that sometimes you're great and sometimes you're terrible. You're strong and you're weak." The prince frowned. "A fool? Terrible? Weak?" he said. The truth is, nobody's perfect. Even you," said Jack. "So just accept it." "You speak nonsense," said Alexander. "It's called humility," said Jack. "Humility?" the prince said slowly. "Jack," said Annie, "look!" She held her hand close to Jack's face. The ring of truth was glowing, as if it were made of fire. Jack smiled again. "Yes, humility," he said to the prince. That was the secret of greatness that Merlin wanted them to discover on this mission. "But you cannot expect me to show humility to the world," said Alexander, shaking his head. "No mighty king would ever do that." "Well, no matter what you have to do to be a mighty king, you can at least have humility inside yourself," said Annie. "And if you do, I promise this horse will trust you." "There he is," a gruff voice said. Jack, Annie, and Alexander turned to see two grooms coming out of the barn. One of the grooms held a whip. You were looking for this horse? Prince Alexander asked sternly. He stepped between the stallion and the grooms. The king wants to see him in the ring again, with the others, said the first groom. He moved around Alexander toward the stallion. As the man's shadow fell over Buddy, the stallion snorted loudly and shied away. Alexander jumped in front of the groom. Get away from him, he ordered the man. Leave him alone. The groom stepped back. Leave us, roared Alexander. The two grooms turned and disappeared back into the barn. Buddy neighed. Shh, my friend, shh, Alexander said softly, stepping toward the stallion. You mustn't be afraid. The horse shook out his mane and backed up. Alexander, listen to him, Jack whispered. Remember, humility, whispered Annie. Alexander stopped and stared into the horse's eyes. The horse stared back at him. The prince slowly held out his hand and stroked the horse's head. Then he spoke softly. Something frightened you just now, he said, when the man stopped in front of you. What was it? Buddy blinked and lowered his head. The shadows? Asked Alexander. The prince held still, but he raised his head. He and Alexander stared at each other for a moment. Then Alexander turned to Jack and Annie. I listened, and I heard him, he said in a voice filled with wonder. He's frightened by shadows. I must remember to always mount him with both of us facing the sun. Jack and Annie grinned at each other. Jack didn't know if Alexander had really heard the horse's thoughts, but he knew that Alexander and the stallion would be fine together. Now, you should prove to your father that you can ride him, Annie said to the prince. Alexander nodded. Yes, he said, his eyes sparkling. He looked like a different person. Yes, I will. Good, said Jack. Go stand with the king. We'll take Bucephalus through the barn and release him into the ring. Thank you, said Alexander. He left them and disappeared around the corner of the barn. Come on, Buddy, Jack said. Jack and Annie led the horse through the barn. Before they reached the entrance to the ring, they stopped. The stallion snorted and dipped his head, and they both rubbed his neck and his nose. Please help Alexander, Buddy, Jack said. He needs a loyal friend, and you need one too. We love you, said Annie. Don't forget that. A groom appeared at the stable doorway. Bucephalus, he shouted. Jack and Annie reluctantly pulled away from the stallion. Be great, Bucephalus, said Jack, his voice cracking. Bucephalus looked at them with soft eyes. Then he walked with the groom out of the barn into the riding ring. Come on, said Annie. Let's go watch. Jack and Annie hurried to the back door of the stable. They shot outside into the sunlight and ran around the building to the riding ring. The king, his companions, and Aristotle were lined up at the fence. Prince Alexander stood with his father. All eyes were on the black stallion as he trotted around the ring, tossing his head and snorting. Good morning, Aristotle called to Jack and Annie. They ran to join him. The king asked about you last night and this morning, he said in a soft voice. What have you been doing? Training them, Annie said. Training who? The philosopher asked. The stallion, said Annie. The prince, said Jack. Aristotle raised his eyebrows, but before he could speak, the king's voice rang out. Come back, you fool! Jack, Annie, and Aristotle all looked at the ring. Prince Alexander had hopped over the fence, and he was heading toward the black stallion. Well, that's it for chapter 9. We have one more chapter to go, but something very important happened in today's chapter. Jack and Annie discovered the secret to greatness, one of the truths of greatness, which is humility. So, I wonder what's going to happen in chapter 10. Alexander is running towards Bucephalus. Do you think he's going to be able to ride him? Join me tomorrow to find out. Bye!